If I told you that some of the oldest prophecies in the world state that the return of Christ may not come from heaven, but from the soil of Africa, would you have the courage to listen to the rest? This idea does not arise from modern theories, but from ancient texts such as the Kebra Nagast, G's manuscripts, records about the Ark of the Covenant, and living traditions in places such as Aksum and Lalibela. It's the kind of revelation that you start out doubting and end up wondering why no one has ever told you this before. Before continuing, do one thing for me: comment below where you are watching now. Your country, your city, the place where you are right now. This helps show how far these stories travel, and who knows, perhaps this connection is also part of the silent movement of this prophecy. And look, I know you've heard a lot about final prophecies, Third Temple, end times. Each video promises a forbidden secret and delivers more of the same. Here it's different. Here you will discover why Ethiopia is seen as an African Zion, why there is a guardian of the Ark living in absolute silence, and why some traditions claim that the divine presence is on the move and may have moved to the only country that has never abandoned its original faith. Perhaps you are searching for answers, trying to connect current events with ancient signs. So take a deep breath, because today we're going to explore territory that few dare touch: hidden prophecies, sacred calendars out of our time, and the possibility that the greatest event in history could happen where no one is looking. When we talk about the return of Christ, almost everyone imagines the same scenario: clouds parting, trumpets echoing, angels descending in light. But what if this imagery is just part of the story? There are ancient traditions, especially from Ethiopia, that suggest that divine manifestation can emerge from the ground, not from the sky, something more discreet, almost hidden. This view does not contradict traditional faith, it expands our understanding, as if to say, take a closer look, God never does everything the way you expect. Think with me, many biblical revelations arrived without spectacle. Jesus' own birth was like this: quiet, humble, far from crowds. So why would the return need to follow the cinematic script that we imagined? Writings such as the Kebra Nagast and traditions passed down in Aksum suggest that the divine presence in motion can emerge precisely where faith has remained firm, pure, and unadulterated. And honestly, this fits perfectly with God's style. He chooses the improbable, not the obvious. Many people expect thunderous signs in the sky, but ignore the spiritual fire that continues to burn in the so-called African Zion. There are Ethiopian monks who believe that the return will be noticed first by those who live in spiritual vigilance, not by those who only expect grandiose events. And when you observe the suffering, resistance, and deep devotion of those people, you realize that perhaps the prophecy is more alive there than in the places where it is only studied. Maybe Christ comes from heaven, but maybe he manifests himself first where no one is looking. In the heart of Aksum, there is a small chapel that seems ordinary to any tourist, but anyone who knows the history knows that something completely out of the ordinary happens there. Inside it lives a single monk, a man who dedicates his entire life to watching over what many believe to be the Ark of the Covenant. He's not famous, he doesn't appear in the media, he doesn't give interviews. Their mission is silent, almost invisible, but deeply spiritual. It's as if its very existence is a reminder that some mysteries weren't meant for the general public. The most curious part: this monk was not chosen because he was strong, influential, or wise in the eyes of the world. He was chosen by the religious community, after years of trials, fasting, and dedication. And once he takes office, he never leaves. It is a lifelong vow: silence, isolation, and total surrender. In a world where everyone wants the spotlight, he is living proof that true spirituality hides in the most unlikely and deepest places. Many people travel to Aksum expecting to see signs, lights, or anything similar to the Indiana Jones movies. But what really impresses is the atmosphere. You get close to the chapel and you feel that something is different there. It's not about seeing the Ark, it's about realizing the spiritual weight of that place, guarded for centuries by men who sacrifice everything for a purpose that few would understand. If there really is a guardian of the Ark, it's hard to deny that his presence there already tells half the story. When you hear about the Ark of the Covenant, the most common story is always the same: it was lost. No one knows where it is, maybe it was destroyed. But in Ethiopia, that narrative simply doesn't exist. For them, the ark was never lost, it was just moved. And this conviction is not new, it spans centuries, supported by G's manuscripts, traditions of the Kebra Nagast, and by the continuous faith of a people who believe that the divine presence has not disappeared, only changed its address. It is as if the West has forgotten history, while Africa has kept it alive. Most striking is how this belief shapes Ethiopia's very identity. Instead of viewing the ark as an archaeological object, they see it as a living symbol, a direct link between God and his people. And when you talk to monks, priests, or even locals, you realize that this is not folklore, it is a certainty as deep as breathing. They don't argue whether the ark exists, they argue only why God allowed her to be taken there. And this vision completely changes the game. Think with me, if the ark really wasn't lost, that means that the flow of history isn't as chaotic as we imagine. It means there is intention, movement, purpose. The notion of divine presence in movement makes even more sense in this context. It's as if God is discreetly changing the pieces, preparing a scenario that the world is not yet ready to see. And this simple possibility already opens a huge door for all the topics that come later. The story of the Queen of Sheba traveling to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon may seem, at first glance, to be just a pretty story about ancient diplomacy. But when you look deeper, you realize that this was much more than a meeting between two rulers, it was a spiritual turning point. According to Kebra Nagast, that moment sealed a bridge between Israel and the future African Zion, long before anyone imagined how this connection would influence future prophecies. It's as if God left a loose thread in history, waiting to be pulled out centuries later. It is interesting to note that, while the West treats this visit as a decorative episode, Ethiopia sees it as something fundamental. To them, Sheba was not just a powerful queen, she was a divine instrument, sent to receive wisdom but also to leave a part of her planted in Africa. This exchange changes the spiritual meaning of the entire narrative. It wasn't just a visit, it was a symbolic transfer of knowledge, as if the spark originally held in Israel had found new ground to flourish. And when you put the pieces together, it all starts to make sense. The lineage that is born from this encounter, the future coming of Menelik I, the possible arrival of the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, none of this seems accidental. It is as if the meeting between Sheba and Solomon had been the first chapter of a much larger plan, a plan that spans centuries and leads directly to the prophecies about the return of Christ and the mystery of the divine presence in movement. And this inevitably leads us to the next point in this story. The figure of Menelik I, son of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, is much more than a historical character for Ethiopian tradition. He is the key that connects two spiritual lines that seemed distant. For many scholars of African faith, Menelik does not just represent royal blood, it symbolizes a prophetic link, as if God had decided to unite Israel and Africa within the same divine inheritance. And it's curious how this story, so alive in Ethiopia, is practically ignored in the West, as if an entire chapter had been ripped out of the book. According to Kebra Nagast, Menelik grew up surrounded by the customs of Israel, learning about the wisdom of Solomon and observing the spirituality that shaped Jewish history. But when he returns to Africa, he doesn't return alone, he takes with him a presence that, many say, changed the destiny of an entire continent. Whatever the interpretation, the fact is that Menelik becomes a symbol that God is not tied to geography, he moves his presence according to his purpose, and this resonates deeply with the idea of a divine presence in movement. When we understand Menelik as this living bridge between two traditions, we begin to see the biblical narrative in a much broader way. Nothing is disconnected, nothing is random. Each line seems to point to a plan that never stopped moving forward, even when the world stopped paying attention. And it is precisely this point, this invisible link between Jerusalem and African Zion, that prepares the ground for the next event, the possible transfer of the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. The idea that the Ark of the Covenant was taken from the Holy Land to Ethiopia may seem surprising to those who only know the Western version of the story. But when you delve into Ethiopian traditions, especially the writings preserved in Ge'ez, you realize that this possibility is part of the country's spiritual identity. For them, Menelik I was not just a visitor to Jerusalem, he was responsible for transporting the divine presence to a new home. And this gives new meaning to the expression divine presence in movement. The most interesting thing is that, according to Kebra Nagast, this transfer was not a robbery or a desperate escape, but an action permitted by heaven. The ark would have been carried with angelic protection, as if God himself were guiding the way to the future African Zion. This detail changes everything. If the ark was moved with divine consent, then the question is no longer why did it leave Israel, and becomes why did God take her there? And this reflection opens up a whole ocean of prophetic possibilities. When we look at Ethiopian history, its ancient monasteries, its unshakable faith, its suffering transformed into spirituality, it becomes easier to understand why that would be a suitable place to keep something so sacred. Nothing there seems to happen by chance. The transfer of the ark is not a historical anomaly, it is a coherent chapter within a much larger narrative, which we are still trying to decipher. And that is precisely what takes us to the next point of this journey. The city of Aksum appears, at first glance, to be just another historical point on the map of Ethiopia. But it only takes a few minutes walking through its streets to realize that there is something different there, almost palpable. In the city center, the chapel of Santa Maria de Sio stands out not for its extravagant architecture, but for the aura of mystery it carries. It is there that many believe the Ark of the Covenant is kept, and even if no one is allowed to see it, the respect around that place already says a lot about its spiritual importance. The curious thing is how the entire environment changes when you approach the chapel. There are no flashy signs, no tourism structures, no attempts to attract visitors. Everything is silent, almost humble. This silence, in fact, fits perfectly with the idea that the ark was never lost, just moved and protected in secret. Many pilgrims and scholars report that they feel a kind of presence there, something difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. And this feeling reinforces the tradition that spans generations. Most impressive, however, is how Aksum has become a point of convergence between history, faith, and prophecy. For those who study the Ge'ez manuscripts and ancient Ethiopian traditions, the city is not just a geographic place, it is a prophetic link, a key piece in the narrative of Christ's return. The Chapel of St. Mary of Zion, even without opening its doors to the world, exerts a fascination that grows with each generation. And it is precisely this central figure, the guardian, and his lifelong vow that leads us to the next topic. The guardian of the ark is an almost mythical figure within Ethiopian tradition. He does not choose, this path is chosen. And once he takes the position, his life changes completely. No travel, no public conversations, no earthly ambitions. Just silence, prayer, and vigilance. It is as if he became part of the chapel itself, a living link between humanity and the sacred. Your lifelong vow reinforces the idea that the divine presence in movement requires someone to accompany it with total devotion. This guardian is not seen as a hero or leader. In fact, it is almost invisible to the outside world. He lives far away, isolated, fulfilling a mission that goes beyond any human recognition. Imagine giving your entire existence to protect something that no one else can see, but that generates an incalculable responsibility. Some say that just his look betrays the spiritual weight he carries. Others claim that not even physical proximity is allowed to preserve the safety of the place. It's impossible not to wonder how someone accepts such an extreme mission. But when we understand the deep faith of the Ethiopian tradition, the answer becomes clearer. For them, guarding the possible Ark of the Covenant is more than a duty, it is a call that touches the soul. And this absolute dedication reveals something important. If there is indeed a prophetic connection between Jerusalem and African Zion, this silent guardian is a central piece of this enigma. A piece that prepares us to understand the next surprising element of this story, the Ethiopian calendar. The Ethiopian calendar always intrigues those who discover it for the first time. While the rest of the world follows the Gregorian calendar, Ethiopia lives 7 or 8 years behind. But are you really behind? For many scholars of Eastern traditions, this difference does not represent delay, but rather preservation. The Ethiopian calendar follows its own rhythm, deeply connected to what they call sacred time, as if it reflects an older celestial order, aligned with spiritual cycles that the West abandoned centuries ago. And you know what's fascinating? This calendar preserves dates that, according to monks, connect to important prophecies in the Kebra Nagast, the Book of Enoch, and the Ge'ez manuscripts. This places Ethiopia within a completely different spiritual timeline and possibly closer to what they call prophetic markers. When you talk to local religious people, you realize that they feel like they walk in a parallel time, as if each year carries a symbolism that the modern world has left aside. When we think about the idea of the return of Christ, this all takes on a new color. If the divine presence truly is in motion, then perhaps it follows the time that has been preserved, rather than that which has been reshaped by the Western world. Ethiopia would not be late. Perhaps you are spiritually advanced, living to a beat that echoes something higher. And this perspective opens up space to understand why so many of their ancient texts preserve what they call the calendar of heaven. And it is exactly this point that leads us to the next topic. Ethiopia has something that many countries have lost: a practically intact textual tradition. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and various manuscripts written in Ge'ez are treated as spiritual treasures not just because they are ancient, but because they preserve a completely different view of time. These texts follow what the monks call the calendar of heaven, a way of seeing the days and seasons as direct reflections of divine order. For them, time is not just chronology, it is a living teaching. The most interesting thing is that these books, long ignored or even rejected by the West, occupy a central place in the Ethiopian faith. While the modern world chases predictions, algorithms, and trends, these ancient texts remind us that some answers only appear to those who understand the spiritual rhythm. When you read Enoch, for example, or even annotated versions that are more accessible, you start to notice patterns, cycles, repetitions. It's as if a heavenly language is hidden between the lines, waiting for someone to pay attention. And it is precisely this careful preservation that reinforces the idea that Ethiopia may be keeping alive a kind of direct line with the divine. If the Ethiopian calendar represents preserved earthly time, these texts are like the spiritual translation of that same time. And this places Ethiopia once again at the center of prophetic interpretations that many believe are related to the return of Christ. And when we combine this understanding with the symbolism of their sacred constructions, we naturally arrive at the next topic. When you arrive in Lalibela, the feeling is strange. It seems like someone took Jerusalem and carved it inside the African land. The monolithic churches, entirely carved into the rock, do not appear to be built, they appear to be revealed. And this has always caught the attention of scholars and pilgrims. There are those who say that Lalibela is not just a group of temples, it is a symbolic replica of the Holy Land, created as spiritual preparation for future events. Some believe that it already represents, in a certain way, what many call the Third Temple. The most curious thing is how these structures emerge without clear records of engineering, architects, or conventional techniques. It is as if the stone itself had given way to the monk's touch. Anyone who steps there feels like they are entering a place that does not follow the rhythm of the modern world. And when you couple this with the Ethiopian tradition that sees African Zion as a spiritual stage, it is not difficult to imagine why Lalibela is so associated with mysteries, prophecies, and the silent movement of the divine presence. This already existing Third Temple theory does not need to be accepted literally to make spiritual sense. Just look at the way Lalibela works as a portal, a reminder, a bridge between the human and the divine. It's as if it was already prepared for something bigger, perhaps not to be built, but to be revealed. And this type of interpretation opens up space for an uncomfortable question, which takes us directly to the next topic. Most people imagine the Third Temple as a physical building, erected at some future time, in Jerusalem, with all the symbolism we already know. But when we look at Ethiopian traditions, this expectation begins to change. For them, certain spiritual symbols do not need to be constructed, they already exist, awaiting discernment. It is as if the temple were not a work of engineering, but a work of revelation. Something God shows when humanity is ready, not when the bricks are stacked. This view makes sense when we remember that many biblical events were like this. They did not appear out of nowhere, but were recognized at the right time. And when you combine this with the existence of places like Lalibela, which seem to have been carved for a greater purpose, the idea of revelation gains strength. Perhaps the true temple need not appear spectacularly, perhaps it has been before our eyes for centuries, hidden in the place where faith has remained purest. This completely changes the traditional interpretation. This reading also reinforces the notion that the divine presence in movement is not tied to geography or human plans. God is not limited to what we expect to happen. Revelation can come from an unlikely, silent place, protected from the modern world. And this understanding paves the way for us to analyze something that many people confuse: Ethiopia's suffering. Is such deep pain really a sign of abandonment, or is there a higher meaning behind it? Many people look at Ethiopia's history: famine, wars, droughts, isolation, and quickly conclude that this suffering is a sign of abandonment. But for the Ethiopians themselves, this reading could not be further from the truth. They see their pain as a process of refinement, not a curse. A type of spiritual test that shapes the character of a people chosen to keep profound mysteries. And when you look at the resilient faith of this country, you realize that there is something special going on there, something that doesn't fit with the idea of punishment. The interesting thing is that this interpretation fits perfectly with biblical logic. Characters such as Joseph, Moses, David, and even Christ himself went through intense suffering before playing their most important roles. Ethiopia looks at these stories and sees clear parallels. For them, carrying the tradition of the Ark of the Covenant, housing G's manuscripts, and keeping the oldest spirituality of Christianity alive requires a type of preparation that only comes from pain. Suffering, therefore, does not weaken, it strengthens. And when we understand this perspective, we begin to see Ethiopia with different eyes. It is as if all the historical weight was preparing these people for a greater revelation, for something that directly connects to the prophecies about the return of Christ. Nothing there seems random. Every tear, every difficulty, every silent victory makes up a narrative that defies human logic. And precisely this narrative leads us to the next topic: an Ethiopian prophecy that is as little spoken of as it is powerful. Among the oral traditions and ancient manuscripts preserved in G's, there is a phrase that passes through generations like a sacred whisper: the light of God will return to the land of the black people. Few people outside of Africa have heard this prophecy, but for Ethiopians, it carries enormous spiritual weight. It's not about superiority or exclusivity, but about destiny. A promise that something great will shine again there, precisely where many think God forgot. And this reversal is too powerful to ignore. The most curious thing is how this prophecy dialogues with so many other narratives. When you place it alongside the story of the Ark of the Covenant, the role of African Zion, the faith preserved in Aksum, and the churches of Lalibela, it all seems to point to a movement that completely escapes the Western radar. It is as if Africa was prepared in silence, while the world chased spectacular signs. This prophecy transforms the improbable into the essential, the forgotten into the central. And when you look at Ethiopia's suffering, resilience, and deep spirituality, that phrase starts to make even more sense. Light does not return to a place by chance. She returns where there is fertile ground, where there is faith capable of sustaining something so great. And this possibility leads us directly to the next point: how Afrodiasporic movements around the world came to see Ethiopia as the spiritual center that the world forgot. In various corners of the world, especially among Afrodiasporic communities, Ethiopia has become much more than a country. It has become a symbol, a promise, a spiritual point of reference. The Rastafari movement, for example, did not emerge by chance. It was born from the enchantment with Ethiopian history, its prophecies, and the lineage that connects its emperors to King Solomon. But that's not all for many. Ethiopia represents the African Zion, a place where the divine presence still pulses strongly, as if God had never left there. This view is not limited to religion. Black artists, writers, community leaders, and thinkers around the world find Ethiopia a spiritual center that challenges the dominant narrative. They see a point of return there, not just geographic, but identity and spiritual. And when you talk to people linked to these movements, it's amazing how they all describe the same feeling. It's as if Ethiopia holds something that the world has forgotten. This perception has everything to do with the idea of divine presence in movement. And when you connect this Afrodiasporic vision with everything we've already explored: ark, prophecies, sacred calendar, Lalibela, it's hard to ignore Ethiopia's central role in so many spiritual narratives. The feeling is that many already notice something that the rest of the world has not yet noticed. And this sensitivity paves the way for the next point: the manuscripts in G's, which contain prophecies that the West simply left aside. The manuscripts written in G's, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, are true spiritual vaults. Many of them have never been fully translated, and much of what is known comes from oral traditions and isolated studies. The West has always looked at these texts with a certain distance, perhaps due to a lack of understanding, perhaps due to not knowing the prophetic weight they carry. But for Ethiopians, these writings contain revelations that don't just illuminate the past, they point to the future. The fascinating thing is that these manuscripts are not treated as dead relics. Monks and priests often study its symbols, calendars, comparisons, and parallels with the Kebra Nagast, the Book of Enoch, and other texts that the West has discarded. Between these lines appear subtle mentions of the divine presence in motion, the ark being relocated, the role of Africa in future spiritual events, and even the concept that the final revelation may emerge from an unexpected place. It's as if the puzzle was there in one piece, just missing eyes prepared to see it. And when we realize how many of these prophecies remain unheard of for much of the world, the feeling is that we are facing a dormant spiritual library. If the West had paid more attention, perhaps many of the questions we ask today would have already been answered. But this unintentional neglect only reinforces the mystery. What if the clues to Christ's return were already written in these ancient texts? It is exactly this question that leads us to the next topic. When we imagine the return of Christ, it is natural to think of large cities, well-known holy sites, or spectacular events that everyone would see instantly. But what if it's just the opposite? What if the return comes from a humble, silent place, away from the spotlight? Ethiopia, with all its spiritual history, its preserved mysteries, and its unshakable faith, fits perfectly into this unexpected scenario. It's the kind of place that the world ignores, and that's exactly why it would be the perfect stage for a divine revelation. This idea makes even more sense when we remember how God traditionally acts in Scripture. He chooses the unlikely David instead of his stronger brothers, Bethlehem instead of great capital, fishermen instead of renowned rabbis. So why wouldn't I choose African Zion, land of the possible Ark of the Covenant, to manifest something great once again? This possibility not only resonates with local traditions, but speaks to the notion of a divine presence in movement, always advancing along surprising paths. And when we connect this vision with the Ge'ez manuscripts, the sacred calendar, the churches of Lalibela, and the forgotten prophecies, the question begins to gain strength: what if we are searching the heavens while God is moving across the earth? This idea does not determine anything, but it opens a huge window for reflection. A window that takes us to the next and final topic. Before the conclusion, are we paying attention to the right signs? It's curious how most people imagine that great spiritual events will always be accompanied by thunder, lights, earthquakes, and celestial announcements. But the truth is that, throughout the entire Bible, God appears more often in silence than in spectacle. Elijah heard God's voice not in the strong wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the gentle breeze. And perhaps that's exactly what's happening today as the world searches for big signs. The most important clues may be emerging quietly, almost whispered, in places like Ethiopia. When you look at Ethiopian history, the ark supposedly kept in Aksum, the silent guardian, the sacred calendar, the manuscripts of Ge'ez, the churches of Lalibela, and the forgotten prophecies, you see that there is a pattern. Nothing there is spectacular to human eyes, but everything carries a depth that is almost impossible to ignore. It is as if the spirituality of those people was a living message, proof that revelation does not depend on noise, but on inner preparation. And this perception completely changes our expectation about the return of Christ. And then the question arises that ties this entire journey together: are we really paying attention to the right signs? Are we not so busy looking at the sky, waiting for flashes and trumpets, that we fail to notice the divine movement happening on earth in silence, in preserved faith, in suffering transformed into spiritual strength? Perhaps the biggest mistake is not doubting the prophecy, but ignoring what it discreetly tries to show us. And it is precisely this reflection that makes room for the conclusion of the script. After going through all these mysteries, the Ark of the Covenant, the prophecies in Ge'ez, the silent monks, the sacred calendar, Lalibela, and the possible African Zion, it is impossible not to feel that there is something bigger happening, something that goes beyond history or tradition. Perhaps what really matters is not finding out where Christ will return, but how we are preparing ourselves internally to recognize this movement when it happens. Because if God really acts in silence, are you training your eyes and your heart to notice what is not obvious? And here is the reflection: how many times do you wait for great signs while ignoring the small spiritual warnings that are already around you? How many times do you look for answers in the heavens while God calls you through simple events, unexpected people, or moments of introspection? Perhaps this is the true invitation of this journey: learning to listen more, observe more, pay attention to what the entire world considers insignificant. After all, what if the biggest revelation of your life is already happening, just silently? So before leaving this video, I make an invitation to you: allow yourself to continue this inner investigation. Keep studying, reading, connecting dots, seeking depth. And if this content opened your mind or your spirit in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave a like. This way you don't miss any of the next chapters of this journey, and together we continue exploring what the world prefers to ignore.